There we go. Let's open up to Mark chapter 11. So where we'll spend our time today. That's Mark chapter 11. All right, here in Mark chapter 11, we've arrived. We've arrived in Jerusalem, where for the last several chapters Mark has been building toward. But now we're in Jerusalem, where the events that would lead up to Jesus' crucifixion will begin to take place. Now, one of those events that we studied and read about was the one we find in verses 12 through 13, or 14, not 13, 12 through 14, where Mark tells the story of the cursing of a fig tree. And that story ended with Mark stating very simply at the end of verse 14, his disciples were listening. Now, as I said, we've looked at that story already, but I want us to go back to that last statement of verse 14. The text says, and his disciples were listening. What does that mean? Okay, they're paying attention to what was being said. Anything else? All right. Yes, that is the idea. They were just paying attention. They saw what happened. They saw what Jesus was doing, and they were paying attention to what he said when he did that. So what that should help us to understand then is that when Jesus cursed the fig tree, there was something he wanted his disciples to learn. And so it's this point about what was to be learned from the cursing of the fig tree that Mark deals with in verses 19 through 26 of this chapter. We're coming back to that story, but now in verses 19 through 26, we begin to see something about what Jesus wanted his disciples to learn from that event. But the story is introduced with another one of those stage-setting verses, where in verse 19 we read, when evening came, they would go out of the city. What city? Jerusalem. So we're in Jerusalem, but we know that at night they would leave Jerusalem. And one thing we talked about is that one reason they had to leave Jerusalem at night is because this is Passover time. Thousands of people, probably in Jerusalem. There's just not enough room for everybody to spend the night there. So some people, Jesus and his apostles included, would leave the city. From earlier in the chapter, we know that they went to Bethany, where they had some acquaintances and friends. And so this is just another one of those instances. They're leaving the city to go back to what we assume is Bethany. Anything else on verse 19? Okay. Moving on into verse 20, text says, as they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. So according to that statement, what condition did the fig tree come into after Jesus cursed it? It was dead. Withered from the roots up. So yes, it's completely dead. Now before Jesus cursed it, it was a pretty well-off tree. It had leaves, and we talked about in that story that part of the reason Jesus cursed it is because it didn't have fruit. But as soon as Jesus cursed it, it withered up and died. And this happened pretty immediately. And we know that because over in Matthew chapter 21, we're not going to go there, but we find the same story of the cursing of the fig tree. Matthew tells us that it withered up immediately. It died gradually. It died just like that, immediately. So since that's true, what we can assume from what Mark records here in verse 20 of chapter 11 of his gospel is that at this point, Jesus and his followers, they saw it. They saw how completely the fig tree had been withered after Jesus cursed it. Anything else on verse 20? Okay. So again, verses 19 and 20 are some of those stage-setting verses, but they set the stage for what Mark will go on to record in verses 21 through 26 of this chapter, where we'll find 2 points about what was to be learned from the cursing of the fig tree that we read about in verses 12 through 14. Now, the first point Mark will make in verses 21 through 23 is that the cursing of the fig tree was a lesson about faith. And the second point Mark will make in verses 24 through 26 is that the cursing of the fig tree was a lesson about prayer. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that we must learn what Jesus taught in his cursing of the fig tree. So with that in mind, we'll just go ahead and read verses 21 through 26, and then we'll look at the point. So again, this is Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 21, we read, "Being reminded, Peter said to him, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered.' And Jesus answered, saying to them, 'Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions.'" So again, this is all about what was to be learned from the cursing of the fig tree incident. And the first lesson is that it was a lesson about faith. Verse 21, the point's introduced. We have Peter coming back onto the scene. What does he say? Oh, go ahead, Shannon. Rabbi, look, the fig tree curse has withered away. So what's Peter doing in saying this? Stating a fact, but also he's making an observation. Says, Rabbi meaning teacher, look, it's withered. So with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that this fig tree, as I've kind of already pointed toward this, but this fig tree did not wither over time. It withered immediately. Again, we know that from Matthew chapter 21. Now, since that's true, one thing we might be able to assume about what Mark records Peter as saying here is that Peter was amazed at what Jesus had done. Now, we know that when a plant dies, it doesn't die overnight. It dies over time. This was probably 2 days past the cursing of the fig tree. It died immediately. Questions or comments on verse 21? That's true. You don't want to get Jesus mad at you. That's a good point. Anything else on verse 21? Okay. So Peter has said what he said. How does Jesus respond in verse 22? Have faith in God. Why respond that way? Why does he respond that way? That's definitely a possibility. Any other ideas? Okay, he's giving the credit to God, absolutely. That's definitely true here. Any other ideas? I'm not fishing for an answer. I'm just wanting us to think a little bit. Okay, if God says he can depend on it happening. So these are all just some possibilities. Mark does not tell us for sure why Jesus responds this way. But this begins to help us to see that what Jesus did with the fig tree had something to do with the necessity to do as Jesus tells Peter to do, to have faith in God. There's a connection between what happened with the fig tree and faith. And we're going to see that more as we get further into these verses. Anything else on verse 22? Okay. So Jesus has said what he said, but the point of that statement is to illustrate the power, is to make a statement about the power of faith. That point is illustrated in verse 23. I'll just read it again. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted to him." So he's talking about faith. According to verse 23, what can faith accomplish? What kind of movements? To cast a mountain into the sea. Now, if I were to go out one of these mountains around here, can I just pick it up and throw it where I want it to throw it? No. Why not? It's not only hard, it's impossible. But Jesus is talking about faith. Faith is able to accomplish the impossible. But what can't be there if faith is going to accomplish the impossible? Doubt. If a person has faith and does not doubt in his heart, but believes in that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted to him. Now, let's bear in mind, his point here is not about the mountain. I could pray with all my heart that one of our mountains around here be thrown over into the sea. I can almost guarantee it won't happen. Not because I'm doubting, but God's will is also at play in this. Jesus is not talking about throwing a mountain into the sea. Well, he is talking about that literally, but that's not his point. His point is about what faith can do. Faith can accomplish the impossible. Now let's tie it in with the fig tree incident. That fig tree was healthy. We saw that in the story. It would have been impossible for this to die because God was taking care of it. But Jesus cursed it with the authority of God behind him. Now it's possible for this tree to have died because of the faith Jesus had when he cursed it. So, what's important to remember is the power of faith, because what Jesus says here has to do with what God is able to do when we have complete faith, which is to make possible that which seems impossible, such as making a mountain get thrown into the sea. Does that make sense? Okay. Go ahead. That's his point. Yeah, this is what we might call hyperbole. In words, he's saying that, but his point of those words is that faith is able to accomplish what's otherwise impossible. And this is his example. So that's a good question, and it's important to keep that in mind. Any of us can read the text, the words of any given passage of Scripture. But our responsibility is to see, well, what's the point being made with these words? The point Jesus is making with these words is that faith is able to accomplish the impossible. Why is faith able to accomplish the impossible? Because of God's power. It's not faith just by itself. It's faith and God's power, as Dina put it, working through that faith. Anything else on verse 23? So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 21 through 23 about what was to be learned from the incident of the fig tree is that the cursing of the fig tree was a lesson about faith. Jesus has shown that one thing the incident of the fig tree should teach his followers is something about the power of faith. Again, it's impossible for a plant to die immediately and within just a few minutes. But you put faith in there, faith can make a plant die immediately. Or faith can make a mountain get thrown into the sea. But it's the power of faith. Faith can make the impossible possible. But again, the condition is that a person must not have any doubt in their hearts. So that brings us into verses 24 through 26. We now move into faith as it ties in with the idea of prayer. So the cursing of the fig tree was a lesson about prayer. Jesus now brings prayer into it in verse 24. Again, I'll just read it. He says, "Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you." So we have this little word, therefore. Can anyone remind me what it's there for?
It's there for to say what went before.
It's there to refer to something that came before. Jesus has talked about faith. Now, how is our faith expressed according to this statement? One way is it expressed, I should say. In other words, what's Jesus talking about here in verse 24? Prayer. Prayer is one way we express our faith. When you go to God in prayer, you're putting your trust in God for whatever you're praying for. The sick, loss of loved ones, other things we might pray about. I'm just using sick and loss of loved ones because that was prayed about tonight. So faith and prayer are closely tied in together. But what does Jesus say here? What does the text say? What words does he use? That's the idea, to pray as if you've already received it. But what has to be in place? If we're going to pray as if we already received it, what has to be there? Faith. Jesus says, believe. You might say, have faith that you have received them. And the result is that it will be granted to you. Now, with that being the case, something we should understand here is that at this point in the story, Jesus is now focusing his attention on not only the power of faith, but the power of prayer. We sometimes use that phrase. And more specifically, what Jesus is doing here is tying together, as I've already said, the faith of verses 21 through 23 in with prayer, to make the point that in everything a person prays and asks for, that person should believe that they have received it, it will be granted to them. So this refers to the fact that when a person prays for whatever they're praying for, they must believe that they will receive what they have prayed for. But again, God's will is also at play in this. So a person has to keep in mind what God's will is when it comes to the things prayed for. Because even though a person might have that complete faith that we talked about, it might not be God's will for that person to receive what they have prayed for. Well, how do we know that? We might ask. We might say, well, David, how do you know that? What did Jesus pray in the Garden of Gethsemane? Your will, not mine. What was he praying for when he said that? To not die on the cross. He did not want to go to the cross. It was a very painful circumstance, and that's putting it lightly. Jesus said that with all the faith in his heart. But he said, not my will, your will. So yes, when you pray, you can have all the faith. There might not be any doubt whatsoever. But at the end of the day, it's God's will that prevails, for lack of a better term. So yes, what Jesus says here is true. Pray as if you've already received something, but keep God's will in mind. Anything else in verse 24? Okay. So far we have faith, prayer, and now in verse 25, Jesus brings something else into the picture. What does he say in verse 25? I'll let you read it again. Okay, he says that, but how does he open? How does verse 25 open? Whenever you stand praying. So now, prayer and forgiveness are coming together. What does forgiveness have to do with prayer? Actually, let me back up. What's something we sometimes pray for in our prayers according to this statement? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's true. That is what this verse is teaching. But it's going beyond that. If you want anything from God, you have to forgive. This isn't just talking about our prayers for forgiveness. It includes that. But back in verse 24, Jesus talked about all things for which you pray. So it's not just praying for forgiveness. If you want anything from God that you're praying for, you better forgive. Forgiveness and prayer are closely tied together. So, what we should understand here is that what Jesus says here indicates that there is some kind of connection between forgiveness and whether or not God will grant what we're asking for, whether it's forgiveness or anything else that we might be praying for. So what Jesus says here also indicates that when Jesus' followers are praying, they ought to be willing to extend forgiveness while they're praying for forgiveness from God for their own transgressions. But again, it goes beyond just forgiveness. Anything else on verse 25? Okay. So Jesus has made that point. So we move into verse 26. Does anyone not have verse 26? Does this? Okay, so you have the brackets. Does anyone not have verse 26? Like, is it completely missing in anyone's Bible? Okay, so everybody has it? Okay. Yes, as Dina pointed out, if you have it, it's probably in brackets or parentheses, whichever you have. There's a reason for that. Some of the earliest versions of Mark's gospel that we have, we don't have verse 26. That's not a huge deal. And the reason for that, the reason it's concluded, and at least our Bible's here tonight, is because over in Matthew 6, verse 15, Jesus says something very similar to this. He says, "But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions." Now, I'm going to tell you something, folks. Mark's gospel, as we have it in our Bibles, this is not the original version that Mark wrote. It's centuries of Mark's original gospel being copied. Now, what happened over time, this is a lesson in how we got the Bible, so I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here. As Mark's original gospel was copied over time, some things got inserted in there because the copier said, "This sounds good." That's not necessarily wrong. Wasn't necessary, but it's not wrong, because these little additions that we have in our Bibles fit with the teachings that were and are in Mark's original gospel. So Verse 26 isn't taking anything away from what's already being taught. It doesn't take away from the credibility of God's word. Again, that's just a lesson in how we got the Bible. But questions, comments? Okay. But again, yes, the point is here that if we don't forgive, we won't receive forgiveness. And that's something we know. So, putting this into the context of what's to be learned from the fig tree incident is that the cursing of the fig tree was not only a lesson in faith, it was also a lesson in prayer. When Jesus cursed the fig tree, he didn't just curse. That was a prayer. It was a small little prayer. Let this fig tree be cursed, and no one eat fruit from it again. It wasn't Jesus' words by themselves that did that. It was God working through Jesus' faith and his words that accomplished that. So the connection between the cursing of the fig tree and prayer is that if you pray with no doubt, God will grant what you ask. But what Jesus also adds here is that if you want God to grant whatever it is you are asking for, you have to be willing to extend forgiveness toward others, especially if you're praying for forgiveness itself. So that's verses 19 through 26. We ask, well, what's the point? The point is there's something to be learned from the cursing of the fig tree. We learned something about faith. We learned something about prayer from that incident. So what we should learn from these verses is that we must learn what Jesus taught in his cursing of the fig tree. We must see that the cursing of the fig tree shows us something about the power of faith. Faith is able to make possible the impossible. We must see that the cursing of the fig tree teaches us something about the power of prayer. As a result of these things, we must see that the cursing of the fig tree was meant to teach us something, which is that we must have faith in God, especially when we pray. If we do have this faith, then God will grant to us what we ask, so long as our prayers are in accordance with his will, where part of that will is for us to extend forgiveness toward others. Now again, that's just some applications of this text to us. Any other questions or comments? All right. Dean, will you close us tonight?